Ed Sullivan sat at his desk at Studio 50 on a Tuesday morning in September 1955, reading the letter for the second time. The handwriting was neat, almost careful, which made the words more disturbing. Mr. Sullivan, we know where you live. We know your daughter's name. We know what school she attends. If you put another Negro on your show this month, we will make you regret it. It was signed with a Ku Klux Klan symbol. Ed placed the letter on top of the other 7 that had arrived in the past 2 weeks. 7 letters, 3 phone calls to his home, 1 message left with his secretary that had made her cry when she read it. To help us keep uncovering these boldest and darkest chapters of history and ensure these untold stories are never forgotten, please subscribe and join our community now. His producer Frank Cohn knocked and entered, saw the pile on the desk and sat down without being invited. Ed, we need to talk about this. This isn't going away. Ed looked at his producer. Then he looked at the letter. Then he picked up his pen and wrote a name on his booking sheet for the following Sunday. Pearl Bailey. Schedule her. Ed said. Prime time. Best slot. And get me Bo Diddley for the week after. Frank stared at him. Ed, these people are serious. I know they're serious. Ed said quietly. That's exactly why we can't stop. Before we dive into this incredible story, hit that subscribe button because what you're about to witness is the story of how one television host used the most watched program in America as a secret weapon against segregation and paid for it in ways that America never knew about. To understand what Ed Sullivan was doing in the 1950s, you need to understand what America looked like. In 1950, the United States was a nation divided not just philosophically but legally. 17 states had laws explicitly prohibiting black and white people from sitting together in theaters, eating in the same restaurants, attending the same schools. The entertainment industry was just as segregated as the rest of America. Major Hollywood studios had strict informal policies about black performers. Radio stations in the South refused to play music recorded by black artists, and television, the newest and most powerful medium, was overwhelmingly white. But Ed Sullivan had been doing something quietly, without announcements or speeches. Since his show began in 1948, he had been booking black performers regularly, presenting them to a white audience in ways that insisted on their equal dignity and talent, not as novelties, not as exotic entertainment. As artists, as equals. It had started almost by instinct. Ed had grown up in Port Chester, New York, and had worked as a sports writer covering boxing before moving into entertainment journalism. Through boxing, he developed friendships with black athletes at a time when such friendships were deeply unusual for a white man from New York. He'd sat at bars with black fighters, eaten meals with them, understood them as men, not as representatives of a race. When he started his variety show, it had seemed natural to book performers based on talent rather than skin color. But what had started as instinct had become by the mid-1950s something closer to a mission. Because Ed Sullivan was beginning to understand the power he had. 50 million people watched his show every Sunday night. That was more than a third of the entire American population. When Ed Sullivan put a black performer on his stage, treated them with respect, applauded them alongside white performers, he was doing something that had almost never been done on American television. He was telling white America, week after week, that black artists were worthy of their living rooms. The backlash had been slow at first. Letters of complaint, canceled subscriptions to the newspaper he wrote for. But by 1955, as the civil rights movement was gaining momentum, as the Supreme Court had just ruled against school segregation in Brown v. Board of Education, the response to Ed's booking practices had become something darker and more threatening. The Klan was organized. They had members in positions of influence in television advertising. They pressured sponsors to pull advertising from shows that featured black performers. CBS had received complaints from affiliates in the South threatening to drop the show entirely if Ed didn't reduce his bookings of black artists. And then there were the personal threats. The letters to Ed's home, the phone calls in the middle of the night, the note that had been placed under the windshield wiper of his car outside the CBS building, with a photograph of his daughter leaving school. Ed's daughter was 15 years old. Her name was Betty. She had no idea that her photograph was being used as leverage against her father's booking decisions. Frank Cohn had come to Ed after the first serious threats. Ed, we should tell the police. We should beef up security. and we should just consider pulling back a little on the black bookings for a few months until this dies down. Ed had looked at his producer with an expression Frank would never forget. If I pull back because they threaten me, I'm not pulling back. I'm surrendering. And if I surrender to this, what have I surrendered? The right to decide who performs on my stage based on talent. That's not something I'm willing to give up. Frank had tried a different argument. Ed, it's not just you. It's the staff. The production team. If something happens at the studio, it's not just you they'll hurt. Ed had been quiet for a long moment. Get me a list of everyone on the production team. I'm going to talk to each of them individually. If anyone wants to step back, wants to work on a different show for a while, I'll understand completely. This isn't their fight if they don't want it to be. Ed had spoken to 63 members of his production team over 2 days. Some were frightened, some were angry, some had their own experiences with racism that made them deeply motivated to continue. But when Ed explained what was at stake, when he was honest about the threats and equally honest about why he believed the work was important, not a single person asked to be moved to another assignment. Not one. The threats escalated. In early 1956, after Ed booked Bo Diddley, Fats Domino, and the Ink Spots in the same month, he received a package at the studio. Inside was a noose. A note attached said, "This is what happens to N-lovers." Ed's security chief wanted to cancel the next booking immediately. Ed opened his schedule book and added another name, Nat King Cole. Ed had met Nat privately before the booking, told him about the threats. Nat had listened without expression. When Ed finished, Nat said something that surprised him. "Ed, I get death threats every time I perform in certain states. My car has been shot at. I've been told I'll be lynched if I perform in specific cities. And I perform anyway. Because if I stop, they win. So don't apologize to me for the threats. Just put me on the show." Nat King Cole appeared on the Ed Sullivan Show 3 times in 1956. Each time, Ed introduced him with the same simple dignity he gave every performer. Not our distinguished Negro guest. Not any of the coded language that white hosts used to signal that a black performer was acceptable, was safe, was approved. Just a name and a talent. The sponsor pressure had been the most insidious threat. CBS had come to Ed with numbers. 3 Southern affiliate stations had dropped the show. 22 advertisers had reduced their buys or canceled entirely, citing programming concerns. The lost revenue was significant. CBS's head of programming had sat Ed down and explained the mathematics of it. Every black performer Ed booked was costing the network money. Not a lot per booking, but over the course of a season, the losses were adding up. Ed had listened to the numbers. Then he'd asked a question. "What's the revenue from our northern and western affiliates?" The head of programming provided the figures. Ed did the math in his head. "We're gaining more from the markets that want integration than we're losing from the markets that don't. The business case for what I'm doing is stronger than the business case against it." He leaned forward, "And even if it wasn't, I'd still do it. Because this isn't a business decision." But the personal threats were harder to rationalize away. One night in October 1956, Ed came home to find his wife Sylvia sitting in the kitchen, pale, with a letter on the table in front of her. Someone had sent a letter directly to their home address with photographs of the Sullivan house taken from outside. The letter named Betty's school, her schedule, the route she walked home. It said that if Ed booked another black performer in November, something would happen to her. Ed sat with Sylvia for a long time that night. This was the conversation that neither of them had wanted to have. Ed had accepted the threats to himself as the cost of doing what he believed was right. But threats to Betty were different. Betty was 15 years old. She hadn't chosen any of this. She didn't deserve to be a target. Sylvia spoke first. "Ed, what do you want to do?" Ed was quiet for a long time. "I want to do what I've been doing. I want to keep booking performers based on talent, not on the color of their skin." Sylvia nodded slowly. "Then that's what we'll do." Ed looked at her. "You're sure?" "Sylvia, this isn't just my decision. This is your family too." Sylvia picked up the letter and folded it carefully. "Ed, I grew up in a country that had very specific ideas about who deserved what based on who they were born to be. I came to America because I believed it was different. If it's not different, If people can threaten a child to maintain segregation and we back down because of it, then what are we here for? Ed had extra security arranged for Betty's school without telling her why. He hired private security for the family home, and he continued booking black performers every single month. In November 1956, 1 week after the letter about Betty, Ed booked the entire lineup of performers from the Howard Theater in Washington, D.C., one of the most celebrated black entertainment venues in America. 7 black performers in a single show. It was the most overtly political act Ed Sullivan had ever taken, and he took it without a press release, without a speech, without any announcement of intent. He just put it on television. The Southern affiliates that had been threatening to drop the show did drop it. 3 stations went dark for that episode. Ed received more threats than ever before. But something else happened at the same time. Ratings in northern and western markets spiked. Young viewers, black and white, watched in numbers that hadn't been seen since the Beatles. The show that week reached 58 million Americans, the highest audience in its history. Civil rights leaders had been aware of what Ed was doing, but they'd been careful not to make it too explicit. If Ed Sullivan was seen as a civil rights activist, it would give his opponents more ammunition. Roy Wilkins of the NAACP had spoken with Ed privately in 1955. "What you're doing matters more than you know," Wilkins had told him. "Every week you put a black performer on that stage and treat them as equals. You're reaching families that civil rights marches never reach. You're reaching people in their living rooms, in their most comfortable and private space, and you're showing them that their assumptions are wrong." Ed had listened and then said something that Wilkins always remembered. "Roy, I'm not doing this as a political act. I'm doing this because the best performers in America include a lot of black artists, and it would be a crime against good television not to book them." Wilkins had smiled. Ed, sometimes the most powerful political acts are the ones that don't announce themselves as political. The threats eventually subsided, not because Ed backed down, but because the culture began to shift. The Civil Rights Act of 1964 changed the legal landscape. The social pressure of the movement made overt racism less acceptable in public. The Klan letters stopped. The phone calls in the night became less frequent. But Ed never forgot what the threats had cost him and his family, and he never forgot why he'd kept going anyway. In 1970, during one of his last major interviews before retirement, a journalist asked Ed directly about his booking practices and whether they had been a deliberate civil rights statement. Ed was quiet for a long moment. "I booked performers who were talented and could entertain my audience," he said. "That's all. The fact that many of those performers were black, and that their presence on my show disturbed certain people, is a reflection of those people's problems, not my policies." The journalist pressed, "Was he aware of the threats?" Ed nodded slowly. "I was aware of them. And I was aware of what it would mean to give in to them. Some things are more important than convenience or safety. Knowing who you are is one of them." The full story of the threats Ed Sullivan received for his booking practices was never widely known during his lifetime. He didn't publicize them. He didn't use them as evidence of his virtue or as a reason for praise. He simply continued doing what he believed was right, absorbing the cost privately, and presenting American television with a vision of what the country could look like when talent was the only criterion that mattered. Historians who later examined the period concluded that Ed Sullivan's Ed Sullivan Show did more to normalize the presence of black artists in white American homes than almost any other single cultural institution of the 1950s and 1960s. Not through speeches or policy or political pressure. Through the simple, radical, repeated act of putting black performers on the most watched stage in America and treating them as exactly what they were, the best artists of their generation. Ed Sullivan died in 1974. At his funeral, among the mourners were performers from across every community he had championed. Pearl Bailey sang. Nat King Cole's widow Clara attended. Dozens of performers who had gotten their first national exposure on his show came to pay their respects. And in the eulogies that were given, one theme appeared again and again. Ed Sullivan had not just given them a platform, He had insisted week after week in the face of threats and pressure and financial consequences that they deserved one. If this story moved you, hit that subscribe button. Ed Sullivan never gave a speech about civil rights. He never marched. He never announced himself as an ally or an activist. He just kept booking the best performers in America, regardless of their skin color, and kept doing it even when men with hate in their hearts told him that they would hurt his family if he continued. Have you ever done the right thing quietly, without recognition, in the face of real consequences? Share your story in the comments below.